Welcome to Fundamentals of Production Advanced Lab Shorts Project Video 1. So in class, you will be given this series of pattern pieces. These are for the shorts. There are 6 pieces total. In class, we will cover how to copy these patterns onto paper so that you have your own copy for cutting out in the fabric. So we're not going to cover that in the video today. What we are going to do in this section is we are going to cut out our fabric. But before we do that, I want to take a closer look at each of these pattern pieces before we put them to fabric. So there are 6 pieces total, and this is our first piece. This is the side front piece. We need to cut 2. You can see our straight of grain line here. And one thing that is important on this particular piece is that the pocket opening is marked. So from this notch to this notch is the pocket opening. You will want to make sure that you copy that onto your fabric in the seam allowance amount. Okay, so let's take a look at piece number 2. Piece number 2 is the front, and the front does include part of the crotch. We have our state of grain, cut 2. But one thing I want to note here is that we have several notches and different seam allowances. So up here, this seam allowance is 1 inch. At this notch, it is still 1 inch. But down here, it turns to 5/8. Make sure that you note when you are copying your patterns that these are the seam allowances and that they change along the line. When we actually get into the fabric, I'm going to show you how we adjust these seam allowance amounts on the same line. Piece number 3 is the side back. It is also cut 2, and it has a pocket opening mark as well from this notch to this notch. That is the only major thing on piece number 3 that I want to point out. Piece number 4 is the back piece. One of the reasons we know that this is the back is because this crotch curve is a lot longer because it's going to go over the rear end of the body, and that is a longer curve around than on the front, typically speaking. This piece is also cut 2. Our straight of grain is straight up and down, but this one is a bit different from the front. This is a 2-inch seam allowance here. At this set of notches, it becomes 1 inch, and right here in the curve, it becomes 5/8. Again, when we transfer this to fabric, I'm going to show you how we grade those lines, but that's important to note that the seam allowance changes along this line. Piece number 5 is the pocket. It has an on the fold cut line. So we're going to cut 2 on the fold. So we do 2 of these on the fold. In theater, we don't actually usually cut on the fold, and I'll show you how we do on the fold for on the fabric. Okay? And then piece number 6 is our waistband. One thing I want to point out is where the straight of grain is. The waistband curves like this, but we want our straight of grain to be right here. The seam allowance is the same all the way around, but what's different about this piece compared to the other ones is this is a cut 4. We need to cut 4 pieces total. You'll also want to make sure when you are copying this over, and you will probably want to do this on your fabric as well, you'll need to mark the center back, and this notch right here is the center front. Okay, let's take this to fabric. Now, for the purpose of this video, I'm going to be, again, using a Sharpie marker as I draw on the fabric because it shows up better in the video. Please, please, please do not use a Sharpie when you are actually transferring onto the fabric. You will want to use something else. Pencils are a viable option. Pens can be used. Just be careful and make sure your marks are correct. You can also use Taylor's chalk. Taylor's chalk come in multiple colors. Any of those options work for transferring to fabric. So let's head to fabric. So now we're ready to transfer our pattern pieces to the fabric. You want to make sure that you are always drawing on the wrong side of your fabric. So this right here is my right side. This side is my wrong side. Now I am working with a very large piece of fabric that doesn't fully fit on the table here, and that is okay. It is best if you are able to have your fabric completely laid out flat so that you know that it is smooth. So if you need to go to a larger work surface, please do so. The lighting right here is just a little bit better for the purpose of this video, which is why I'm working here. So what I'm doing at this moment is I am pinning my fabric down to make sure that it is flat and smooth as possible before I start transferring my pattern pieces onto the fabric, because we don't want any weird wrinkles from the fact that the fabric is not laid out completely on the table. Okay, so what you're going to need is you're going to need your pattern pieces, whatever you're using to trace your pattern pieces, a ruler for putting in the seam allowance, and pins to pin your pattern piece to your fabric. So I'm going to start with piece number 1, and along the top edge here is 5/8. Along this edge is 5/8. This edge with the pocket opening is a 1-inch seam allowance, and the bottom is a 1-inch seam allowance. My straight of grain goes this direction. Remember, the straight of grain is the same direction as your selvage is. So down here, you can see how this is a little bit discolored because this is where it was woven together. This is the straight of grain. So for this fabric, since the pattern is multi-directional, I'm going to lay my fabric or my pattern piece exactly to the same straight of grain that is the true straight of grain. If you have a pattern with a direction on it, say like a stripe, and your stripes are going this way, but you want your stripes to go this way down the pattern, you can turn your pattern piece so that your straight of grain is going with the cross grain. That is fine. It is strongest when it goes with the true straight of grain. Cross grain is okay. Just don't do this. Don't cut your piece on the bias because that will warp your piece. So one way you can make sure that your piece is perfectly lined up with the true straight of grain is that you can match up. I'm going to scoot this down just a little bit. With your ruler, you can find the edge of your seam allowance. Turn this a bit so you can see it a little bit better. There we go. You can line up your ruler with the straight of grain, the selvage edge, and then match up your straight of grain line on your pattern piece. So right there, it's 6 inches from the edge. I'm going to do the same thing down here on the opposite end because see, it's just a tiny bit off. So I'm going to put a pin right here on this straight of grain so that this spot doesn't move and rotate this down. Okay, that's 6 inches there, 6 inches there. It is perfectly lined up with the straight of grain. So I'm going to pin this in place and then trace it. With every pattern, you want to draw your pattern on one side with the markings one side up, and then you'll want to flip it and do the opposite side. So typically, when in most garment making outside of theater, you would, if you have the instructions to cut two, you would actually cut through 2 layers of fabric. We don't like doing that in theater because you can't be guaranteed that the underlayer is laying flat and straight. We use all of these seam lines. You'd have to go back in and draw them on. So what we have to do is we have to draw it with one side up, flip it over, and draw it again. So since I know I'm doing this side right now, I am going to take a sticky note, just because this is the shop's pattern. This stays for use for future students. And I'm going to stick a sticky note on this side so that I know that I have patterned this side onto my fabric. Okay, so I'm just going to grab my Sharpie. I'm going to draw right along the edge of the pattern because this is my stitch line that I will use later. This particular pattern piece is made of cardstock, so it makes it very quick to trace the stitch line on. Okay, so now I need to do my seam allowance. But before I do my seam allowance, I always like to mark my notches so I don't forget them. Okay, so those are my notches. I'm also going to use a fine point Sharpie, just because I'm using Sharpie. It shows up better in this video. And I'm going to write in the seam allowance, pocket opening, right here, so that I don't forget what the space between these notches is for. All right, so I've got my stitch line on, and I'm going to go around and put my seam allowance in. I'm only removing a few pins. I'm not taking all the pins off at a time. Okay, so draw out my seam allowance. I'm going to extend this out that way. This pattern has lots of curves in it, so make sure that you're not using the full length of the ruler on every side, because then your seam allowance isn't matching the shape of the pattern underneath. There we go. Small section at a time. Okay. I'm going to do 5/8 from this direction, just a little bit at a time. It's a little too far, so I'm going to back it up so that I keep with that shape. Okay, so this is 1 inch here along the bottom. You can use a full ruler like what I'm using, or you can use a seam gauge, whatever is comfortable for you. As you can see, I didn't take all of my pins out completely because I don't want my pattern piece to move. Even though I have the seam allowance line there, it's just a little easier for me to see to line up my seam allowance with the pattern instead of the stitch line. Connecting all my stitch line or my cutting lines. All right, so before I pull my pattern off, I'm going to double check and make sure that I have all of the markings that I need. I've got my notches, my seam allowances. I've marked that this is the pocket opening, so we're all good. So now what I want to do is I'm going to take this off. I'm going to actually take my Post-it note, rip it in half. So I've cut this side. Now I'm ready to do this side. Okay, I'm going to slide this down. Make sure it's on the straight of grain. That looks to be about right. And I'm going to pin this in place. So I had to flip this over because if we were cutting through 2 layers of fabric, one piece would be like this one, where the face of the instructions are face down. So what I'm going to do, because I need to know what all of my seam allowances are on the other side, is I'm going to find the seam allowance, flip it over, and mark it on the back side so that I can copy all of those over. 5/8 over there, 1 inch, and then 1 inch on the bottom. Okay, this is the edge that I need to do. Pin this down and repeat the process. Okay, marking my notches. Between there and there is the pocket. And since I copied all of my seam allowance amounts onto this side, I don't have to take it off to flip it over to find out what my seam allowance amount is. I can just do it from here. Okay, so piece 1 is now completely done. I'm going to leave the Post-it notes on both sides so that I know I copied both sides. So we're going to move along to the next pattern pieces. I'm going to show you those and only point out the parts that you need to know for copying to your fabric, but otherwise we'll kind of montage our way through, or I'll just skip the unimportant parts. Okay, so here is piece number 2. One of the interesting things about this piece is that we've got to have our seam allowance go from 1 inch up here down to 5/8 down here. So I'm going to show you how to do that. So here's our straight of grain. So I'm going to put it matched up with the straight of grain, pin it in place. Before I actually get it pinned in place, I'm going to go ahead and quickly add my Post-it note so that I know that I'm working on this side. Okay. There we go. That's a better grain mark. Pin the whole thing down. There are more notches on this project than the last one you did. Make sure before you remove any pattern piece that you double check to make sure you have all of your notches. They are extremely important to the assembly of this project. I'll do my stitch lines. Going carefully and slowly to make sure that I don't make any of those stitch lines incorrect. All right, I'm going to put my notches in. Notch there, notch there. Okay, so let's take a look at this seam allowance specifically, because the other ones are pretty straightforward. It's 5/8 all the way across, 5/8 all the way across, an inch and an inch. But we need to go from 1 inch down to 5/8. This 5/8 is going to occur right here at this notch. Okay, so I'm going to grab my seam gauge, which is a very small ruler. This is my seam gauge. And I'm going to, right here at the top, measure 1 inch over and make a little tiny mark. I'm going to do the same thing right here because at this notch it still says 1 inch. In a moment I'll make sure that all the way through here is 1 inch as well. I'm going to mark 5/8 right here at this notch. I'll do kind of a little dot right there. Now roughly halfway between, I want to split the difference between 1 inch and 5/8. And a good in the middle is about 3/4 approximate. So right around the middle, I'm going to go to 3/4. And now I've got a mark here, a mark here, and a mark here. We do have in the shop, we have curved rulers, and so you could use a curved ruler to perfectly connect this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to very slowly and carefully connect these markings that I did, making sure that I don't dip into further in than the seam allowance allows. Okay, so when I get to that 5/8, I'm going to stop and use my seam gauge at 5/8 the rest of the way around. All right, there we go. Okay, so I just kind of gently connected the dots in a smooth line. All right, so that's the main thing for this one. You go ahead and do an inch from here to here, just like you normally would on any other place. But when you connect the dots here, you just want to grade around. So I'm going to continue on this one, and we're going to skip ahead with the video to the next piece that does something like this so I can show it to you. Remember, as you copy each piece to your fabric, flip it over so that you have both sides of your pattern. With this particular piece, the fronts and the back, these curves, it's going to be vitally important that you flip your piece over. So do some sort of mark, draw on your piece saying done, so you know which side you have completed. Okay, so let's skip ahead to the next piece that needs extra attention. Now I am on piece number 4. I've already drawn out my stitch line, so now I need to put in the seam allowance. This is the back piece of the short, and along this curve we have another one of those seam allowance grades, but it's a little larger than the front side because we go from 2 inches to 1 inch to 5/8 down and around. So right here at the top, it's 2 inches. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark 2 inches from this top corner. 2 inches. Put just a little mark right there. Okay. Now down here at the 1 inch, I'm going to do the same thing. So straight across from those notches, I'm going to make a very small mark. It's hard to see against this fabric, but the mark is there and there. And then right here, I need to put in my 5/8 mark. Right along there, I'm going to do a tiny mark as well. Now, since from the top edge of this piece to the notch is fairly straight, what we can do is just put our ruler right here at the 2-inch mark, line it up with the 1-inch mark, and draw that seam allowance. So there's 2 inches down to 1 inch. I'm going to connect those two marks that I did. Okay, so that is connected. In a moment, I'll move the camera a little closer so that you can see that line better. But here we've got a curve, so I can't just connect the dots from here to here because then otherwise it's not coming out even. So I want to do the same technique that we did before, where I take my seam gauge and about halfway between these two marks, I'm going to mark 3/4 of an inch. Right there. And then I'm going to artfully connect these two marks. There we go. And then along the rest of this edge, I can do 5/8. So real quick, I'm going to move the camera closer so that you can see this line that I've drawn, how we go from 2 inches to 1 inch to 5/8. Can everyone see that? See how that line grades around? That is exactly what you're looking for. The rest of the edges are straight, or not straight. The rest of the sides of this piece are the same seam allowance all the way down. Don't forget to mark the side that you cut or that you've drawn out, flip it over, and do the same thing again. Let's take a closer look on how to transfer pattern piece number 5 to our fabric. This piece is the pocket and it is cut on the fold, which means that this edge, the fold edge, is also the straight of grain. So you want to find the straight of grain on your fabric and line up this edge with the straight of grain on your fabric. This piece we're going to draw out a little differently. So I'm going to start here at the top edge. I'm going to draw across, but I am not going to draw down this line because we don't need a mark here down the middle for the fold. So I'm going to draw all of the sides, the stitch line on all of the sides except where on the pattern it is marked on the fold. We do have with our pocket, we've got 2 notches right here, so I'm going to mark those. And in a moment, I will do my seam allowance. But before I do that, I do want to add an additional notch mark of sorts. So right here at the corner, I'm going to make a very small notch mark at the top and at the bottom, well, at the bottom, top and the bottom, so that in just a moment, after I draw my seam allowance in, I'm going to unpin this piece, flip it over, and then my straight of grain line is going to match up. This corner and this corner are going to match up with those notches again. So I'm going to flip that over in just a moment. So let's quickly montage through putting in the seam allowance, and I'll show you how we're going to flip it. Okay, so now we are ready to flip this piece over to draw it out as if it had been cut on the fold. Because remember, we only cut through one layer of fabric at a time because we can't guarantee that the bottom layer is going to be straight like it should be. So I'm going to remove these pins, double check that I have my notches marked there and there, which I do. I have my notches at my corners marked so I know where to line this up when I flip it over. So I'm going to flip this over and match my corners back up with those notch marks. Pin the whole thing back down and then repeat the same process with drawing my stitch line along the top, the outside edges, and no stitch line here where the fold line was. Add my seam allowances, and then this piece is complete for the first piece. This is a cut on the fold, cut two. So I need to do this process twice, where I do one side, draw out half of it, flip it over, and draw the other half. The last piece that's a little odd and really important that we cut correctly and mark out correctly is piece number 6, the waistband. You have a straight of grain line, but it's very small because it's hard to show the straight of grain across this whole curve. So you want to be especially careful that your straight of grain is straight and exactly where you want it to. I do highly recommend finding your selvage edge and making sure that this is even across and matched up. And I'm actually a tiny bit off. So I'm going to shift this a bit so that it lines up perfectly with my selvage edge. Okay. This piece does have some bias into it. So as you draw it out, you may see your fabric kind of moving under you a little bit. Just draw slowly and carefully. So I'm going to draw my stitch line very carefully, making sure that my fabric is not shifting in those areas where the straight of grain turns into the bias against this piece. Okay, this piece has two notches, one right here and one right here. This notch also marks the center front. So I'm going to transfer CF right here by the notch to mark that it is the center front. And this edge over here is the center back. So I'm going to transfer that mark over as well. So now we just have to add the seam allowance in, and this piece is also different from the others because you need to cut 4 pieces, not just 2. So make sure you give yourself plenty of room to stack this on top of itself in your fabric. Again, you do have to flip this over. So you want 2 with the instruction side facing up and 2 with the instruction side facing downward. Double check that your straight of grain is in the exact spot on both sides. If you need to, you can, like on our original pattern, punch a little hole on each end of your straight of grain so that you can connect those dots on the opposite side to see your straight of grain for when you flip this piece over. Okay, and that is it for copying all of the pattern pieces onto your fabric. Let's move on to the next video.